9 families stood beneath the gray morning sky at Pine Hollow Memorial Garden, waiting to bury people they had already buried once. Some held flowers. Others held folders thick with contracts, receipts, and photographs of headstones they could no longer trust. Behind them, 18 more families were waiting for answers. For years, they had visited graves, spoken to names carved in stone, and believed the people they loved were resting where they had been promised. Then the court told them the records could not be trusted. 27 families had been caught inside a system of duplicated plots, altered maps, and missing ownership files. 9 would have to endure supervised reburials. Others would be forced to replace markers or live with the possibility that the ground they had mourned over belonged to someone else. At the center of it all was Mara Bell, the funeral home bookkeeper, who had built her reputation on remembering every name. The town called her cold, predatory, unforgivable, and the evidence gave them reason. Mara had accepted money she knew she had no right to take. She had allowed an innocent employee to carry the blame for an early theft. Years later, when a cemetery caretaker tried to help her confess, she hid evidence and let suspicion turn toward him. Even the woman who had taken Mara in after her mother died became one of the people she deceived. But long before Mara controlled burial maps, she had been a 12-year-old girl standing alone in the same cemetery. Her mother had died poor. There was no polished stone, no permanent marker, and no money for anything beyond the simplest county-assisted burial. Months later, after rain and maintenance crews changed the ground, Mara could no longer tell exactly where her mother lay. That day, she learned a lesson no child should have learned. Poor people could disappear twice. First, from life, then from memory. For years, Mara believed she was fighting that kind of disappearance. She told herself she was protecting families, preserving names, and keeping a struggling funeral home alive. But somewhere between the first missing envelope and the 27th broken promise, protection became control. Understanding where that darkness began does not excuse what it became. The real question is not whether Mara Bell was wounded. It is when she decided other families could be wounded in her place. The courtroom in Black Ridge County had been built to make people feel small. Its ceiling rose higher than necessary. The wooden benches were narrow and unforgiving. Even the clock seemed louder there, each second landing with the weight of something that could no longer be taken back. Mara Bell sat at the defense table in a plain county-issued uniform, her hands folded in front of her. She was 44 years old. For most of her adult life, people had known her as the woman who remembered every family, every payment plan, every birthday printed beside a name in an old file. Now no one in the room called her careful. They called her deliberate. The prosecutor did not begin with the amount of money Mara had taken. He began with names. One by one, he read the families affected by the altered maps, duplicated contracts, and missing ownership records at Pine Hollow Memorial Garden. 27 families. Some had already lost parents. Some had buried spouses. Some had purchased neighboring plots years in advance because they feared being separated even in death. Evelyn Cross was the first to speak. Her parents had been married for 53 years. They had bought 2 plots side by side and kept the receipts in a metal box beneath their bed. After both were gone, Evelyn visited every Sunday, placing fresh flowers between the 2 stones because she believed they were still together. Then the investigation began. The records did not agree. The plot numbers had been reassigned, the map had been revised more than once, and the documents, bearing Mara's initials, led Evelyn's family into months of uncertainty. By the time the court supervised a new burial arrangement, grief had returned in a form Evelyn had never imagined. "You made us question the only place where we thought the questions were over," she told Mara. Mara lowered her eyes. Behind Evelyn sat Amos Reed. His hair had gone almost completely white during the investigation. He had spent 31 years maintaining Pine Hollow, learning the slopes, the older sections, and the family histories that had never been entered into a computer. When he first warned Mara that the records were wrong, she had not thanked him. She had made him look responsible. Amos had been suspended, questioned, and spoken about in town, as if his memory had failed before the evidence finally cleared him. He had been offered his position back. He refused. Jenna Bell sat 2 rows behind him, close to the state investigators. She did not look at her mother. That absence hurt Mara more than the prosecutor's words. Jenna had once believed every story Mara told about dignity, service, and protecting families who could not protect themselves. She had grown up inside the funeral home, doing homework beside filing cabinets and watching her mother comfort strangers. Now she knew some of those same cabinets had been used to hide what Mara had done. Outside the courthouse, one man told a reporter that Mara was a monster. The word traveled through the hallway before the judge returned. Mara flinched when she heard it, not because she believed herself innocent. By then, too many signatures, contracts, and recorded decisions stood between her and innocence. The word hurt because she had heard smaller versions of it long before Pine Hollow. Trouble, untrustworthy, the kind of girl who would take something if no one watched her. Blackridge had many names for poor children who learned to hide what they needed. But being wounded by a label did not make Mara's choices less real. It did not restore Amos's name. It did not return Clara Finch's lost years. It did not give Evelyn Cross back the quiet place she thought belonged to her parents. When the judge asked Mara to stand, the courtroom rose with her. Before the sentence was read, the judge said the case was not only about money or property. It was about the exploitation of grief by someone who understood exactly how defenseless grief could make a family. Mara closed her eyes. For one moment, the courtroom disappeared. She was 12 again, standing at the edge of Pine Hollow with a paper trembling in her hand. Her mother's name was printed near the top. Beneath it were a row number, a section letter, and a few directions written by someone who had never known Lillian Bell. At that age, Mara still believed that if a name was written down, someone would protect it. She did not yet understand that she would spend the rest of her life trying to become that someone, or what she would eventually destroy to keep the power. Blackridge, West Virginia, had once been the kind of town where a man could leave school on Friday and begin work at the mine on Monday. By the time Mara Bell was old enough to notice what adults feared, the mine was reducing shifts, storefronts were closing, and nearly every family knew someone who had packed a car and driven toward Ohio or Kentucky looking for work. Mara lived with her mother, Lillian, in a second-floor apartment above a boarded pharmacy. The windows rattled in winter. The heat worked when the landlord remembered to send someone into the basement. On cold nights, Lillian pushed a kitchen chair beneath the oven door and let the warmth drift into the room while warning Mara never to touch it. Lillian worked nights at an industrial laundry outside town. She cleaned hotel sheets and hospital linens beneath fluorescent lights that made every face look tired. The chemicals dried the skin around her knuckles until small cracks appeared no matter how much lotion she used. She kept her hands hidden when she signed school forms because she did not want teachers looking at them with pity. She was not careless with money. There was simply never enough of it. A late utility notice might arrive the same week Mara needed new shoes. A prescription could erase what Lillian had saved for rent. When the landlord knocked, he did not speak to them as though they were tenants experiencing hardship. He spoke as though unpaid money had changed what kind of people they were. Mara learned to recognize the color of envelopes before she understood all the words inside them. Red print meant danger. A window showing Lillian's name meant someone wanted something they did not have. At first, Mara placed every letter on the kitchen table. Then one evening, she watched her mother open 3 of them after a 12-hour shift. Lillian sat beneath the weak ceiling light, pressing 2 fingers against her forehead while Mara pretended to complete her homework. Nothing dramatic happened. Her mother did not scream or collapse. She only looked smaller than she had a minute before. That frightened Mara more. After that, Mara began slipping certain envelopes behind a loose panel beneath the bathroom sink. She told herself she was giving her mother one peaceful evening, then another. When Lillian asked whether the mail had come, Mara sometimes said no. The lie was small. Its effect was also small. It did not transform Mara into someone cruel. It gave her a brief sense that bad news could be controlled if she reached it first. That was the lesson she carried forward. Not that lying was good. That truth could be delayed until a person felt strong enough to survive it. Lillian eventually found the letters. She did not strike Mara or call her dishonest. She sat beside her on the edge of the bathtub and explained that hiding a problem did not stop it from growing. "We face what has our name on it," she said. Mara nodded, ashamed. But what stayed with her was not the lesson Lillian intended. Mara remembered how exhausted her mother had looked when the truth arrived all at once. She decided the real mistake had been letting the hidden letters accumulate, not hiding them in the first place. By the time Mara was 11, Lillian's health had begun to fail in ways neither of them could afford to examine properly. She coughed through the night. Some mornings she sat on the bed fully dressed for work but unable to stand. She missed shifts, lost hours, and returned too soon because every day away created another bill. A neighbor named Lenora Pike brought soup and offered rides to a clinic across the county. Lillian accepted help only when she could promise to repay it. She had spent too many years being spoken to, as if poverty had erased her judgment. Mara watched this and formed another dangerous misunderstanding. She began to believe that needing help gave other people ownership over your choices. Independence was not merely a practical goal to her, it became a defense against humiliation. Lillian died in late autumn, several weeks after Mara turned 12. There was no life insurance, no family savings. Mara's father could not be located, and the relatives whose numbers Lenora called either had no money or no room for a child. The county approved a basic burial through a public assistance program. The funeral was held on a weekday morning. Only a few people attended. Lenora, 2 women from the laundry, a pastor who had met Lillian once, and Mara. Pine Hollow Memorial Garden sat on a low ridge beyond the edge of town. The public assistance section was farther from the paved path, where the ground was uneven and the markers were simple. Lillian's place was identified by a temporary metal stake and a typed record listing the section and row. Mara stared at the stake because it seemed too small to represent a whole life. Her mother had laughed loudly when old songs played on the radio. She had cut coupons with careful scissors. She had stayed awake after night shifts to help Mara study spelling words. None of that fit inside a number assigned by an office. Still, Mara copied every detail from the burial paper into a school notebook. She wrote the section, row, date, and nearby landmarks. She believed precision could protect what money had failed to protect. For the first several weeks, Lenora drove her back to Pine Hollow every Sunday. Mara counted her steps from the edge of the path. She memorized the shape of a tree and a patch of stone near the slope. She placed small flowers beside the temporary marker and checked that Lillian's name remained readable. Winter came hard that year. Rain softened the hillside before freezing temperatures tightened it again. Maintenance workers cleared brush, repaired drainage, and replaced several temporary markers that had shifted. Mara did not visit for almost 2 months because Lenora's car needed repairs. When they returned, the section looked familiar but not exact. The tree Mara remembered had lost a large branch. The patch of stone was partly covered with mud. Several metal stakes stood in lines that seemed slightly different from the notebook drawing she carried. Mara walked back and forth until Lenora asked her to stop. A grounds employee checked the office record and pointed toward a narrow area between 2 markers. He was patient, but he could not give Mara the certainty she wanted. The paper showed where Lillian had been assigned. The ground no longer gave a 12-year-old anything she could recognize as hers. Lenora told her that the record mattered. The pastor later said her mother was not contained by a place. Both were trying to comfort her. Mara heard something else. She heard that adults could accept uncertainty because the missing person was not their mother. From that day forward, she stopped trusting memory unless it was backed by something she could control. Affection could fade, landmarks could change, people could promise to remember and then move away. A record seemed permanent, and the person guarding it seemed powerful. Lenora brought Mara home, gave her the small bedroom at the end of the hallway, and placed clean sheets on the bed. She said Mara could stay as long as necessary. Mara thanked her. Then she folded Lillian's burial paper into quarters, wrapped it in a plastic sandwich bag, and hid it beneath the mattress. She had been offered safety, but she was already preparing for the day it might be taken away. Lenora Pike's house stood 3 streets from the apartment where Mara had lived with her mother. It was narrow, with fading blue siding, a screened porch, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee. The bedroom Lenora gave Mara had once belonged to her daughter, who had moved to North Carolina. Old dresses still hung behind a winter coat, and an empty jewelry box remained on the dresser. Lenora offered to clear everything out. Mara asked her not to. An empty room would have felt temporary. The forgotten clothes made it seem as though people could leave and still be expected back. Lenora tried to create routines: breakfast at 7, homework before television, Sunday visits to Pine Hollow when the weather allowed. She signed school forms and corrected anyone who referred to Mara as a charity case. But Lenora was not wealthy. Her husband, Walter, had a heart condition and expensive medication. The roof needed repairs. Every new expense entered the house quietly, followed by another calculation at the kitchen table. Mara noticed when Lenora chose cheaper groceries. She noticed Walter cutting pills in half after an insurance dispute. She noticed the coffee changed brands after she moved in. No one blamed Mara. That did not stop her from blaming herself. A school counselor explained that Lenora was seeking temporary guardianship while the county looked for relatives who might offer a permanent placement. Mara heard the word temporary and stopped listening. To Lenora, it described a legal process. To Mara, it described every promise she had ever received. One night, Mara overheard Lenora speaking to her daughter by telephone. Lenora said she loved Mara and wanted to keep her safe, but she did not know how long she and Walter could manage the added costs. She mentioned medical bills, guardianship papers, and the possibility of a more stable arrangement. Lenora never said she wanted the girl gone. She was asking for advice. Mara heard a deadline. The next afternoon, she opened Lenora's purse and took $40. She hid it inside a sock at the back of her drawer. It was not enough for rent or a bus ticket. The money was not a plan. It was proof that she would not be completely helpless if the house stopped being hers. 2 days later, Mara saw Lenora searching for the cash and asking Walter whether he had used it for medication. Shame arrived before fear. Mara returned $30 that night. She kept 10, not because she needed it, but because returning everything felt like surrendering the only protection she had made for herself. Lenora understood what had happened. She waited until they were alone, then asked whether Mara had been afraid of something. The question was harder than an accusation. Mara could have admitted she had heard the telephone call and that the word temporary made every room feel borrowed. Instead, she denied taking anything. "You do not have to earn your place here by being perfect," Lenora said. "And you will not lose it because you tell me the truth." Mara wanted to believe her, but believing meant placing her safety in someone else's hands again. It meant trusting that love could survive disappointment. Mara could not take that risk. She said nothing. Lenora remained kind, but a quiet distance entered their conversations. Mara became more helpful, more polite, and less honest. She washed dishes before being asked and watched Walter when Lenora went shopping. She tried to make herself useful enough that keeping her would feel easier than sending her away. Her need for belonging began to change. She no longer asked whether people loved her. She asked whether they still needed her. Walter died 18 months later. His death did not make Lenora abandon Mara, but the household changed in ways grief could not prevent. The pension ended. Medical debt remained. Lenora sold Walter's truck and began missing mortgage payments. The county reviewed Mara's placement. Lenora argued that she could continue caring for her, but the social worker saw unpaid bills, a leaking roof, and an older woman struggling alone. The decision was not cruel. No one said Mara was unwanted. The arrangement simply became impossible. That distinction mattered to the adults. It did not matter to Mara. She spent several months with a distant cousin in Charleston, sleeping on a couch and keeping her possessions in 2 grocery bags. The cousin was not abusive, but the apartment was crowded, and every disagreement reminded Mara she was there because someone else had failed to keep her. Lenora called each week. Mara often claimed she was busy. She could not forgive Lenora for losing a battle the older woman had never promised she could win. More deeply, she could not forgive herself for needing the promise. By 17, Mara was working evenings at a diner and weekends at a convenience store. She enrolled in a bookkeeping course through a community program, but dropped out after the transportation vouchers ended. When an instructor offered to help her apply for emergency assistance, Mara refused. She called it independence. In truth, assistance required her to explain what she lacked. To Mara, that felt like giving someone a list of reasons she might not be worth the cost. She learned to survive without asking. She memorized bus schedules, kept receipts in labeled envelopes, and tracked every dollar in a notebook. Numbers comforted her because they did not pretend to care before delivering bad news. At 19, Mara saw a handwritten notice in the window of Calder Funeral Home. The business needed a part-time office assistant who could type, organize accounts, and work quietly around grieving families. The building stood beside Pine Hollow Memorial Garden. Mara almost kept walking. Then she saw an older woman struggling with 2 boxes at the side entrance. Mara helped without being asked. The woman introduced herself as Ruth Calder and invited her inside. During the interview, Ruth placed a sample ledger on the desk. Mara noticed one payment entered twice and another assigned to the wrong family. She pointed out both errors, then apologized for speaking too quickly. Ruth looked relieved. "Most people see columns," she said. "You see who gets hurt when the columns are wrong." Mara had never heard competence described as care. Ruth hired her for 3 afternoons a week. On Mara's first day, she received a key to the side door and was shown the cabinets containing decades of contracts and burial information. Ruth explained that families trusted the funeral home with details they could not bear to repeat. Mara rested her fingers on a metal drawer handle. Here, being exact could protect people. Here, the skill she had built from fear might become useful. For the first time since Lillian died, the future did not look like escape. It looked like responsibility. Ruth had offered Mara another home. Mara closed her hand around the key and made a private promise. She would become too valuable to lose. Ruth Calder did not train Mara by handing her a manual. She taught her by letting her listen. From the office beside the arrangement room, Mara heard families struggle to choose words for decisions they had never imagined making. Some spoke too quickly. Others repeated the same question because grief had made it difficult to hold on to an answer. Ruth never rushed them. She wrote everything down, then read it back slowly, so no one left believing something different from what had been promised. To Mara, that precision felt almost sacred. Within months, she could identify a family account by the sound of a surname. She caught misplaced payments, corrected dates, and noticed when 2 contracts used different spellings for the same person. Her work saved the funeral home from small errors that might have become painful arguments later. Ruth praised her carefully. She did not call Mara gifted or exceptional. She said she was dependable. The word meant more to Mara than Ruth knew. Dependable people were invited back. Dependable people received keys. Dependable people were not discussed in another room as an expense that had become difficult to carry. Ruth paid for Mara to complete a bookkeeping certificate at the community college. On the evenings Mara attended class, Ruth kept the office open late so she could finish her shift afterward. She never described the tuition as charity. She called it an investment. A year later, Ruth asked Mara to accompany her to Pine Hollow. Near the older public assistance section stood a modest granite marker bearing the name Lillian Bell. Ruth had located the burial entry, confirmed the section with the cemetery office, and paid for the stone without telling Mara. Mara touched the engraved letters but did not feel the certainty she expected. The marker gave her mother dignity. It did not erase the memory of walking the hillside, unable to recognize the ground. Still, she thanked Ruth. For several years, Mara lived carefully. She paid her rent on time, saved small amounts, and avoided debt whenever possible. Then, the diner where she still worked occasional weekend shifts closed without notice. The lost income arrived in the same month that her landlord raised the rent and demanded an additional deposit. Mara was short by less than $200. She considered asking Ruth for an advance. Ruth had helped before and would probably have helped again. But Mara imagined the concern in her face, the questions, and the possibility that Ruth would reconsider giving so much responsibility to someone who still could not keep her own life stable. One afternoon, a family paid the final portion of a service bill in cash. The envelope remained in Mara's desk because the bank had already closed. She held it longer than necessary. The amount inside was more than she needed. Mara told herself she would take only enough to satisfy the landlord and return it after her next paycheck. No family would lose a service. No account would remain unpaid. The ledger would be corrected before anyone noticed. She removed the money and wrote the full amount into the deposit log. For 2 days, the lie existed only in her desk. Then Ruth counted the cash before making the deposit. She did not accuse anyone publicly. The office had 4 employees with access to the desk that week. Mara, Ruth, a funeral assistant, and a temporary receptionist named Clara Finch. Ruth gathered them after closing. "Someone may have made a bad decision because they were frightened," she said. "That is not the same as being beyond repair. Come to me tonight, and we will deal with it privately." Mara felt the money in her purse as if it had grown heavier. She waited outside Ruth's office after the others left. The door stood partly open. Ruth was inside completing paperwork, leaving Mara a path that required only a few steps. Mara imagined admitting everything. She imagined Ruth's disappointment. She imagined losing access to the files, the classes, the key, and the identity she had spent years building. Lenora's old promise returned to her, telling the truth would not cost her a home. Mara had not believed it then. She did not believe Ruth now. She walked away. The next morning, suspicion shifted toward Clara. Clara had been late twice that month because her car was unreliable. She had recently asked whether employees could receive an advance on their wages. Those facts did not prove anything, but they formed a story people found easy to accept. Mara could have ended it with one sentence. Instead, when Ruth asked whether Clara had been near the desk, Mara said she could not remember. That was not a direct accusation. It was worse in a quieter way. Mara remembered exactly. Clara denied taking the money. She offered to let Ruth search her bag and even asked the police to check the office, believing certainty would protect her. No charges were filed because there was no evidence, but Ruth could not keep a temporary employee she no longer trusted, and Clara was dismissed before the week ended. On her final afternoon, Clara stood beside Mara's desk, holding a cardboard box with a coffee mug and a sweater inside. "Do you believe me?" she asked. Mara looked at the ledger instead of Clara's face. "I don't know what happened." The sentence preserved everything Mara feared losing. It also took something from Clara that could not be returned by replacing the money. Mara restored the missing cash after her next paycheck and adjusted the deposit record so the account appeared complete. No family lost money. Ruth's business continued. The books balanced again. For a while, Mara used those facts as evidence that the damage had been limited. But Clara had lost a reference, a paycheck, and the right to leave the building with her honesty intact. Ruth had offered Mara mercy and unknowingly given it to the wrong person. Mara had allowed the truth to settle on someone with less power because that person's life seemed easier to sacrifice than her own. Guilt made Mara work harder. She arrived early, stayed late, and corrected mistakes before Ruth saw them. She became so reliable that the idea of her taking the money soon appeared impossible. That transformation should have brought relief. Instead, it taught Mara something dangerous. A lie did not have to disappear if the person telling it became useful enough. It only had to look less believable than the truth. For nearly a decade, Mara Bell gave Blackridge no reason to doubt her. She arrived before the first family appointment and often remained after the chapel lights were turned off. She remembered which widows needed extra time before signing forms, which sons could not speak about money without becoming angry, and which elderly couples had already chosen where they wanted to be buried. None of that care was false. Mara had seen what happened when grief met poverty. She knew how quickly a family could be made to feel ashamed for asking what something cost. At Calder Funeral Home, she tried to make sure no one was hurried, mocked, or treated like a burden because they needed a payment plan. Ruth trusted her with more responsibility each year. By 27, Mara was managing the accounts, preparing tax documents, and reviewing cemetery contracts before Ruth signed them. She had also become a mother. Jenna was born after a brief relationship that ended before the child could remember her father. Mara did not speak badly of him. She simply built a life that did not require him. Ruth became the closest thing Jenna had to a grandmother. The girl grew up doing homework at a side desk while Mara balanced accounts nearby. Ruth kept crayons in the bottom drawer and let Jenna choose flowers for the reception room. On quiet afternoons, the three ate sandwiches together and talked about anything except death. Those years mattered. They proved Mara had not been doomed by childhood. She had work, a child who trusted her, a woman who loved her without demanding repayment, and a community that respected her. She also had a secret. The money taken from the envelope had been restored long ago. Clara Finch's name had not. Mara sometimes imagined finding Clara and admitting what had happened. Each time, she postponed it. Clara might have rebuilt her life. Ruth might never learn the truth. Reopening the past, Mara told herself, could injure people who had already moved on. The explanation sounded compassionate. Its real purpose was protection. As the coal industry weakened, more families arrived with little savings and no insurance. Mara created installment plans with smaller deposits and longer payment periods. She negotiated with vendors, reduced certain fees, and quietly covered minor shortfalls from a discretionary account Ruth allowed her to manage. The program helped people. A retired miner buried his wife without selling his truck. 3 sisters kept their mother's service in the church she had attended for 40 years. A young widow received 6 additional months to pay for a memorial marker. Mara kept their thank you cards in a desk drawer. She read them when she felt uncertain about the kind of person she had become. Blackridge began to see Mara as more than a bookkeeper. She was the person families requested when they feared they could not afford dignity. The praise eased something inside her. It also created a new fear. If people stopped needing her, what would remain? When a regional hospital offered Mara a position in its finance department, the salary was higher, the hours predictable, and the benefits would give Jenna stability Mara had never known. Lenora urged her to accept. "You have spent enough of your life around endings," she said. Jenna, then 11, liked the idea of her mother coming home before dinner. Ruth did not ask Mara to stay. She said the hospital would be fortunate to have her. That freedom should have made the choice easier. Instead, it frightened Mara. At the hospital, she would be one employee among dozens. No family would ask for her by name. No one would say the business could not continue without her. She would have security, but not the importance she had learned to confuse with belonging. Mara declined the offer. She told Jenna the funeral home needed her. She told Lenora she could not leave Ruth as the older woman approached retirement. Both statements contained truth. Neither contained all of it. Soon afterward, Ruth proposed making Mara a minority partner. The change would give her a formal share in the business and eventually allow her to take over daily operations. There was one requirement. Before the agreement could be signed, an outside accountant would review the books. The old cash discrepancy was small and buried beneath years of correct deposits. Mara did not know whether an auditor would find it. What frightened her more was the possibility that someone might compare staffing records, ask why Clara had been dismissed, or uncover the adjustments made after the money was replaced. She did not refuse directly. She produced estimates showing how expensive the audit would be. She argued that business had been slow and suggested waiting until the next fiscal year. Ruth accepted because Mara had earned the right to be believed. That trust should have forced Mara to reconsider. Instead, it rewarded the delay. Ruth continued referring to Mara as her future partner. Families continued thanking her. Jenna continued describing her mother as the person who helped people when they were most afraid. Mara wanted all of those things to be true. She began measuring truth by how much good would be destroyed if it were spoken. The audit could expose an old betrayal. The hospital job could weaken Calder Funeral Home. Leaving might hurt Ruth. Confessing might damage Jenna's image of her mother. Every honest choice appeared to carry a cost, and Mara had become skilled at counting costs that belonged to her. She was less willing to count the cost of silence for anyone else. Then Ruth suffered a mild stroke. She survived, but her speech became slower, and her right hand remained weak. For several months, she could not conduct meetings or review contracts without assistance. Mara stepped in immediately. She managed the employees, spoke with vendors, reassured Grant Calder that the business remained stable, and sat beside Ruth during rehabilitation appointments. No one had to ask her to take control. She had spent years preparing to become indispensable. Now the role was hers. One evening, after the last employee left, Mara sat alone behind Ruth's desk. The key ring beside her opened the office, the accounting room, and every locked cabinet in the building. For the first time, there was no one above her checking the work. The life Mara had once hoped to earn was still within reach, but it had become tied to something more dangerous than survival. She no longer only wanted a place that could not be taken from her. She wanted to be the person who decided whether the place survived at all. Ruth's stroke did not close Calder Funeral Home. For the first few months, Mara made sure no one could even say it had slowed down. She met families in the arrangement room, approved vendor payments, reviewed cemetery schedules, and drove Ruth to rehabilitation twice a week. Employees began bringing questions to Mara before they brought them to anyone else. By the time Ruth could return for short afternoons, the business was already moving through Mara. That control felt earned. It also made the next problem feel personal. Grant Calder arrived from Charleston with financial statements spread across Ruth's desk. He was Ruth's nephew and the only family member with a legal interest in the business. He did not understand every custom in Blackridge, but he understood declining revenue, unpaid invoices, and a cemetery that required maintenance whether families were buying plots or not. The mine had cut another shift. Younger residents were leaving. More people chose direct cremation or county assistance because traditional services had become impossible to afford. Grant proposed selling the funeral home to a regional chain. Mara heard the word selling and felt the building change around her. The side entrance where Ruth had first handed her a key became a door someone else might lock. The desk where Jenna had done homework became furniture a corporation could replace. Even Ruth's name above the entrance suddenly looked temporary. Grant was not cruel. He did not demand an immediate decision. He gave Mara 6 months to present a lawful plan that could keep the business independent. "Show me the numbers," he said. "Not hope, numbers." Mara promised she would. The honest numbers were worse than Grant knew. Payment plans were months behind. Several vendor accounts were overdue. Mara's low-cost programs had helped families, but the business had absorbed more of the difference than she had admitted. Ruth's medical absence had also reduced the number of higher-paying services. Mara could have shown Grant everything. She could have reduced staff, suspended new payment plans, closed an underused section of Pine Hollow, or accepted that the business might survive only in a smaller form. None of those choices were painless, but all of them were legal. Instead, she prepared 2 versions of the financial picture. The first showed Ruth and Grant a business under pressure but capable of recovery. The second, kept in a locked drawer, showed how little time remained. Mara called the difference temporary. She believed income would improve before the hidden obligations mattered. Then she began reviewing old cemetery contracts. Pine Hollow had expanded in stages over several decades. Some sections were mapped by surveyors. Others had been recorded in ledgers, handwritten notes, and family agreements that had never been transferred cleanly into the newer system. In one older section, Mara found a plot listed as available on the working map, but connected to an unresolved reservation in a paper file. The family attached to the older reservation had moved away years before. No recent payment appeared in the account. There was no immediate request to use the space. A new client wanted that exact area because it was close to relatives already buried nearby. Mara could have marked the plot unavailable until ownership was confirmed. Doing so would cost the funeral home a sale it badly needed. She sat with both files open in front of her. This was not like the money in the envelope. She could not tell herself she was borrowing something that belonged to the business. She was accepting payment for a promise she knew might already belong to someone else. Mara understood the difference. She signed anyway. The money covered payroll that Friday. No employee missed a check. A groundskeeping invoice was paid before service was suspended. Grant saw improved cash flow and delayed further discussion of a sale. For the first time, Mara's wrongdoing produced visible relief for people who had done nothing wrong. That mattered more to her than it should have. Employees thanked her for keeping the business steady. One of them said Ruth was lucky Mara had taken control when she did. Ruth, still struggling to write with her right hand, squeezed Mara's fingers and said she had saved the place. Mara went home that evening, feeling both ashamed and vindicated. She told herself the older reservation was probably abandoned. She would contact the family, offer another location, or repurchase the new contract before either side needed the plot. The conflict existed only in paperwork. No one had yet been denied anything. That word "yet" became important. It allowed Mara to treat future harm as a problem for a future version of herself. Several weeks later, another obligation came due. A monument supplier threatened to stop all new work until an overdue balance was paid. Mara expected money from 2 installment accounts, but both families asked for more time. She opened the cemetery files again. This time, the contradiction was easier to recognize and harder to excuse. A couple had reserved 2 neighboring plots years earlier, but only one payment record had been carried into the current system. Mara knew the surviving spouse might eventually expect the second space to remain available. A different family was ready to pay immediately. Mara did not decide in a moment of panic. She spent 2 days calculating alternatives. She called vendors, reviewed credit options, and considered telling Grant the truth. Every legal path ended with layoffs, a closed cemetery section, or the possible sale of the funeral home. Those outcomes were painful. They were not impossible. Mara chose the unlawful path because it preserved the version of Calder Funeral Home in which she remained the person who had saved everyone. After the second contract, the first could no longer be dismissed as an exception. The business now depended on money, attached to promises that could not all be honored. Ruth noticed Mara was no longer leaving the office at a reasonable hour. She suggested reducing services and allowing Grant to negotiate with the regional chain. "A place can change and still keep its purpose," Ruth said. Mara heard defeat. She assured Ruth that the worst had passed. Then she introduced a revised working map for the staff. The unclear areas were simplified. Notes about older reservations were moved out of daily view. The original ledgers and survey copies went into a locked cabinet under Mara's control. She did not destroy them. Some part of her still believed she would use them later to make everything right. But the map on the wall now showed the cemetery as Mara needed it to be, not as the families had been promised it was. That difference marked the beginning of something larger than financial desperation. Mara was no longer hiding an old mistake. She was creating a reality that could survive only as long as no one asked the right question at the same time. The first two conflicting contracts should have frightened Mara into stopping. Instead, they showed her how much could remain invisible when every family saw only its own promise. She expanded the low-cost program across Black Ridge. Deposits became smaller. Payment periods grew longer. Mara negotiated cheaper packages with suppliers and allowed families to postpone charges. Larger funeral homes demanded immediately. The help was real. A mechanic whose wife died after a long illness did not have to borrow against his tools. An older woman kept enough savings to remain in her apartment after burying her sister. A young couple who had lost a parent within weeks of losing their jobs were treated with patience instead of suspicion. People remembered those things. They sent handwritten cards to Ruth. At church fundraisers, they described Mara as the woman who never let money become another humiliation after death. Mara listened and felt two emotions at once. Pride, because she had become the person she once needed. Relief, because good people were not supposed to do what she was hiding. The program also brought in new deposits. Some paid current expenses. Some covered obligations connected to earlier contracts. When a conflict appeared, Mara shifted a family to another available area, delayed a marker order, or assured them that final placement details would be confirmed later. She avoided looking at the problem as a whole. One file could still be corrected. 2 could be explained. 5 could be blamed on the cemetery's age. Mara treated every contradiction as a separate inconvenience, because seeing them together would require a different word. System. Jenna began helping in the office during college breaks. She had grown up around the building and understood enough bookkeeping to notice patterns other employees missed. One afternoon, she compared the number of new cemetery agreements with the deposits entering the operating account. "The sales are higher than the available spaces on the current map," she said. Mara explained that older reservations were often released, transferred, or never completed. She said paper records created temporary differences that would disappear after reconciliation. Jenna asked to see the older ledgers. Mara told her they were too fragile to handle without supervision. The answer was reasonable. The speed with which Mara gave it was not. Jenna continued looking at the numbers. Mara felt the same fear she had once felt outside Ruth's open office door, but she did not respond with silence this time. She used Jenna's love. "This place paid for your school," Mara said. "Ruth trusted us with her whole life. Be careful about turning normal mistakes into accusations." Jenna had not accused her of anything, but by the end of the conversation, she was apologizing. Mara watched her leave and understood exactly what she had done. She had taken gratitude, one of the best things between them, and used it to make a reasonable question feel disloyal. The shame did not make her call Jenna back. It made her lock the accounting screen. Outside the office, Mara's reputation continued to grow. A local reporter wrote about Calder Funeral Home surviving the collapse of the coal economy without abandoning working families. The article included a photograph of Mara beside Ruth. The headline called Mara, "Black Ridge's Keeper of Dignity." Grant framed it and hung it in the lobby. He also stopped discussing a sale. The business appeared healthier, and the community response gave Calder a value no regional chain could easily reproduce. Ruth read the article several times. "You saved what I thought I was going to lose," she told Mara. For a few seconds, Mara nearly confessed. She imagined placing the older ledgers on Ruth's desk and explaining how the first conflict had begun. She imagined asking Ruth to help contact the families before the damage became larger. Then, Ruth smiled with the exhausted pride of someone who believed her life's work was safe. Mara could not bear to become the person who took that comfort away. She told herself confession could wait until Ruth was stronger. By then, Amos Reed had begun noticing changes on the grounds. Amos had worked at Pine Hollow for more than 3 decades. He did not speak about the cemetery as a collection of spaces. To him, each slope belonged to a network of memories. A husband who visited before sunrise, sisters who planted the same flowers every spring, a veteran whose friends gathered each November. He knew when paperwork did not match what families had been told. At first, the differences seemed minor. A reservation number appeared beside the wrong row. A family asked about a neighboring plot Amos remembered as already promised. A marker order referred to a section whose boundaries had been redrawn. Amos assumed the new system had imported old information incorrectly. He brought a question to Mara. She answered smoothly, explaining that some reservations had expired and others had been reassigned after non-payment. Amos accepted the explanation because Mara had earned years of trust. The second time, he asked for supporting release forms. Mara said Grant's attorney had them. The third time, Amos discovered that his access to several cabinets had been removed. Mara called it a new privacy policy. Amos did not argue. He began keeping notes of his own. The growing danger was not that Mara had become careless. She remained careful. She remembered which explanation she had given to which person and limited who could view older records. The danger was that she had become calm. Each successful delay taught her that urgency belonged to other people. Families could wait. Vendors could wait. Questions could wait. The truth could wait until Mara had enough money, time, or control to release it safely. Meanwhile, new families continued to thank her. Their gratitude became private arithmetic. Mara counted the widow who kept her apartment, the mechanic who kept his tools, and the workers whose paychecks arrived on time. Against them, she placed the families whose future claims might conflict. The first group had faces and voices. The second remained paperwork. That imbalance allowed Mara to believe the good was heavier. But the hidden obligations continued multiplying. Some involved unclear boundaries or incomplete transfers. Others involved direct promises that could not coexist. By the time Mara counted every affected agreement, 27 families were tied to records requiring investigation. She wrote the number on a yellow legal pad. 27. The scale frightened her. Not enough to confess, but enough to divide the list into smaller categories. She marked some as easy corrections, some as unlikely to be used soon, and others as matters that could be settled with replacement plots. When she finished, the number had not changed. Only the language around it had. Jenna returned a week later and asked again about the older records. Mara accused her of distrusting the woman who had raised her. Jenna left without apologizing. That frightened Mara more than the question. The following morning, Amos entered carrying a rolled survey map, 2 handwritten ledgers, and copies of several contracts. He closed the office door. "I thought these were old mistakes," he said. "They aren't." Mara recognized every document. Amos did not threaten her or call her a criminal. His voice carried something more difficult to face. Disappointment. He spread the oldest map across the desk and pointed to the first contradiction. "Sit down with me," he said. "We need to know how far this goes before another family signs anything." For years, Mara had controlled the questions by making sure no one could see all the answers at once. Now, someone else had begun putting them together. Amos did not begin by asking Mara why she had done it. He began with the contracts. He placed them in order across the desk, matching each one to an older reservation, a handwritten note, or a survey mark that no longer appeared on the working map. He had not yet found every conflict, but he had found enough to understand that the problem could not be explained by age, weather, or careless record-keeping. Mara watched his finger move from one family to the next. For years, she had protected herself by keeping each contradiction separate. Amos had removed that protection simply by placing the pages beside one another. "We stop signing anything in these sections," he said. "Then we go to Ruth, Grant, and the county attorney in the morning." Mara expected anger. What Amos offered was worse. A way back. He said he would admit that he should have challenged the altered map sooner and would stand beside her while the business requested an independent review. He was not promising to save her from the law. He was promising she would not enter the truth alone. Mara asked how much he intended to tell Ruth. "All of it that we know," Amos said, "before we learn more from somebody standing at the wrong place." The sentence landed without accusation. That made it impossible to dismiss. Mara agreed to meet them at 9 the next morning. After Amos left, she remained in the office until the building was dark. She did not spend those hours preparing a confession. She searched for a version of the truth, small enough to survive. Perhaps she could describe the first contracts as temporary corrections. Perhaps the older reservations had expired under rules no one had applied consistently. Perhaps Amos had misunderstood changes made before Mara took control. Each explanation required the listener to see only part of the evidence. By midnight, Mara was no longer deciding whether to tell the truth. She was deciding how much truth other people could be allowed to see. Jenna arrived before she left. She had returned for a charger but noticed the office lights. On the copier tray, she found 2 contracts tied to the same area of Pine Hollow. The dates were years apart. Both carried Mara's initials. Jenna read them twice. "This isn't reconciliation," she said. "You sold the same promise again." Mara told her the cemetery records were complicated. Jenna asked whether Amos had been right. Mara said Amos had worked too long from memory and had begun confusing old arrangements with current ownership. She suggested his notes might have caused some of the contradictions. The claim was deliberate. Mara knew Amos's memory was not the problem. She also knew Jenna respected him. By placing doubt around his competence, Mara hoped to weaken the only person who could explain the grounds without relying on her files. Jenna did not accept it. She gave her mother 48 hours to report the contracts herself. "If you tell them," Jenna said, "I will believe there is still a part of you trying to stop this." Mara heard the condition inside the sentence. For the first time, her daughter's love no longer felt guaranteed by their history. It depended on what Mara chose next. That should have made the choice simple. Instead, Mara felt cornered by the person she had raised. At 9 the next morning, Amos sat in Ruth's living room with Grant and the attorney. Mara did not come. She sent a message claiming a family emergency, turned off her phone, and drove beyond Blackridge. Amos waited nearly an hour before showing the documents without her. The attorney recommended suspending new sales in the questionable sections and beginning an immediate audit. Grant agreed. Ruth asked only whether Mara knew. Amos answered carefully, "I think she knows more than I do." By the time Mara returned, Grant had scheduled a meeting with an outside reviewer. He wanted part of Pine Hollow closed until the records could be verified. Mara argued that a closure would create panic. Families would demand answers before the business had any. Rumors could destroy Calder before the audit distinguished real conflicts from paperwork errors. Grant reminded her that uncertainty was the reason to stop. Mara responded with payroll, vendor obligations, and jobs that could disappear if revenue froze. The facts were accurate. She used them to make caution sound irresponsible. Ruth listened from her chair. She looked older than she had the day before. "What are you asking us to protect?" Ruth said. "The families or the building?" Mara could not answer directly. She said she needed a few days. Grant gave her none. He ordered the affected sections closed. Mara left before Ruth could ask another question. Jenna was waiting outside. She had already heard Mara had missed the meeting. "All these years, you said you stayed because Ruth needed you," Jenna said. "Does Ruth need this? Or do you need to believe she does?" Mara felt anger rise because the question reached the part of her reasoning she had avoided naming. She accused Jenna of judging sacrifices she was too young to understand and listed the years spent building stability for them both. Jenna did not argue about any of it. She only asked whether those sacrifices gave Mara the right to make other families carry the cost. Mara had no answer that did not sound like confession. She told Jenna to leave. The command echoed after the front door closed. For several minutes, Mara stood alone in the lobby beneath the framed article calling her Blackridge's keeper of dignity. The words no longer comforted her. They looked like evidence of how much she had needed other people to misunderstand her. Then the entrance bell rang. Lenora Pike stepped inside carrying a small folder. Age had bent her shoulders, but her voice remained steady. She had decided to purchase the plot beside Walter, while she could still make the arrangements herself. Mara knew the location before Lenora said it. The space beside Walter's grave was tied to one of the clearest conflicts Amos had uncovered. Lenora placed her hand over Mara's. "I came to you because you understand," she said. "You know what it does to a person when they cannot be sure where someone they love is resting." On the desk between them lay an unsigned contract. Mara could refuse the sale, tell Lenora the truth, and accept that the woman who had once given her a room would finally see what she had become. Or she could sign and buy herself a little more time. For most of Mara's life, fear had arrived wearing the face of abandonment. Now it arrived as trust. Mara read the contract once more before placing it in front of Lenora. The location beside Walter's grave had been reserved years earlier under a family agreement that had never been properly released. Amos had shown Mara the conflict. Grant had already ordered that section closed. There was no uncertainty left for her to hide behind. Lenora spoke about Walter's final months and how he had feared leaving her alone. She wanted the plot beside him because separation had already asked enough of them. Mara could have said the section was under review. She could have offered another location or admitted that the promise Lenora wanted could not safely be made. Instead, she signed. The payment was no longer large enough to rescue the business. Mara accepted it because refusing would force her to explain why the woman who knew her childhood best could not trust her now. "I knew you would take care of me," Lenora said. Mara felt the betrayal before the ink dried. Twice that afternoon, she reached for the telephone to call Lenora back. Each time, she imagined being asked how long she had known. No answer preserved the person Lenora believed she was, so Mara did nothing. Amos continued searching the older storage areas before Grant's outside reviewer arrived. In a weathered document box, he found records from the county-assisted section of Pine Hollow. Among them was a small metal identification tag wrapped in a faded envelope. Lillian Bell. The original notation placed Lillian near a boundary later redrawn several times. Mara's working maps had shifted the reference points. The stone Ruth purchased years later had been positioned according to a copied entry, not the earliest surviving survey. Amos could not say the marker stood in the wrong place. He could say Mara's changes had made certainty harder to recover. He carried the tag and oldest map into the office after closing. For most of her life, Mara had treated Lillian's uncertain grave as the wound beneath every compromise. She had told herself that keeping Calder alive protected other families from the humiliation she had known. Now the tag rested in Amos's palm like a verdict. "The changes crossed the old boundary," he said. "We need the county surveyor before anyone says where this belongs." Mara stared at her mother's name. If Amos was right, she had buried the truth of the one place she believed justified everything beneath the same altered lines used against other families. For several minutes, she stopped defending herself. She admitted there were more conflicts than Grant knew and said the first had been meant to save payroll. Amos did not argue about her intentions. He asked where the complete list was, then he offered to go with her again. If Mara released every file, stopped all transactions, and helped identify the affected families, she could prevent more months of uncertainty. "You cannot fix what you did," he said. "But you can stop making other people carry it." It was the clearest choice Mara had ever received. Tell the truth and lose the business, her freedom, and the identity she had built. Or keep control by making Amos less believable than she was. Mara chose control. She asked him to leave the tag so she could verify its number. He hesitated, then placed it on the desk because he still believed some part of her wanted to do the right thing. After he left, Mara locked it with the original ledgers. Then she opened the maintenance logs. Amos had corrected location notes by hand for years. Some entries lacked dates. Others used abbreviations only he understood. Mara copied several pages and marked places where his changes appeared to conflict with later records. The documents did not prove Amos had caused the problem. They created enough confusion to delay belief. The next morning, Mara told Grant that Amos had made undocumented changes and might be reconstructing locations from memory. Grant did not fully believe her, but he could not ignore a possible chain of custody problem. Amos was placed on administrative leave while the review proceeded. He left Pine Hollow carrying his lunchbox and jacket. By evening, people in town were already saying age had caught up with him. Mara regretted it before his truck reached the road. But regret did not make her call Grant. It did not return the tag. It did not restore Amos's name. Jenna learned about the suspension that night. "Did he do this?" she asked. Mara said the records were complicated. Jenna understood. She packed a bag, took the copies she had made of the conflicting contracts, and left. 3 days later, heavy rain washed soil from the outer slope and exposed damaged boundary markers. The county closed the area and ordered an independent survey. The surveyors found inconsistencies the internal review could no longer contain. Boundaries did not align with contract references. Multiple families held documents pointing toward the same spaces. Old reservations had disappeared from working files without proof that the rights had ended. The contradictions began reaching families who had never met one another. That was what finally broke Mara's control. Jenna contacted state investigator Naomi Price and provided her copies. Amos turned over his private notes. Grant opened the business accounts to investigators. By the time Mara was called for questioning, the case was no longer about old paperwork. It was about who had known, who had benefited, and who had been made to carry the blame. Before leaving the funeral home, Mara asked to see Lillian's marker. The survey team had sealed the affected area. Mara stood behind the temporary barrier, close enough to read her mother's name but unable to approach it. For years, she had believed control was the only protection against disappearance. Now, every file was beyond her reach, and the grave she had built her life around had become another place waiting for someone else to tell the truth. The investigation lasted 11 months. By the end, Naomi Price no longer needed to argue that Pine Hollow's problems came from one damaged map or one careless employee. The pattern appeared in bank records, contract dates, altered access logs, and the timing of Mara's decisions. Money from later agreements had covered earlier obligations. Notes disappeared after families asked questions. Sections remained open after internal warnings. When Amos challenged the records, documents were selected to make his corrections look suspicious while hiding Mara's instructions. The state recovered Lillian Bell's metal identification tag from the locked cabinet. That discovery cleared Amos and proved Mara had possessed evidence she denied seeing. Calder offered Amos his job back with full seniority. He declined. He said he no longer wanted to work in a place where his knowledge had been used to make dishonesty look like age. Clara Finch was harder. Can you do left West Virginia years earlier and worked in a motel outside Knoxville. When investigators contacted her, she initially refused to participate. Then Naomi showed her the deposit adjustments. Clara agreed to testify. She did not claim Mara's first lie caused everything that followed. She said Mara had learned early that an innocent person could carry the consequences while she preserved the life she wanted. Jenna provided the copies she had made before leaving Blackridge. She also identified the conversations in which her mother tried to discredit Amos. She did not testify because she hated Mara. She testified because silence had become the inheritance Mara was trying to leave her. The review identified 27 affected families. 9 required court-supervised reburial arrangements. Others received corrected deeds, replacement markers, refunds, or settlements. None of those remedies restored the years in which people had visited a place believing every promise beneath it was secure. Calder Funeral Home closed before the trial. Its property was sold, but the proceeds could not cover every claim. Grant surrendered his interest in Pine Hollow to a court-appointed trust. Ruth moved into assisted living and sent a written statement. Ruth said Mara's poverty would never have made her unworthy of love. The theft from the envelope would not have ended her future. Even the first cemetery conflict might have been faced if Mara had spoken before the damage spread. What broke this family, Ruth wrote, was not that Mara needed mercy. It was that she never believed mercy could survive the truth. Mara pleaded guilty to several financial and records-related charges, but contested the most serious counts involving obstruction and knowingly conflicting agreements. Her attorneys described the failing business, her childhood, and the real assistance she had provided to poor families. The prosecution did not deny any of it. Helping one widow keep her home did not authorize Mara to deceive another. Preserving jobs did not give her ownership of other families' grief. A painful childhood could explain why control felt like safety. It could not erase the moments when Mara knew another person would pay and continued anyway. At sentencing, Evelyn Cross spoke first. She described the emptiness that followed every Sunday visit after the truth emerged. The place where she once spoke freely to her parents had become a question she carried home. Lenora followed. She faced Mara only after the judge asked whether she needed more time. "I will not call you a monster," Lenora said. "A monster would let you hide inside the idea that you were never capable of choosing better. You were. I know because I watched people offer you better, again and again." Mara began to cry. Lenora did not ask the court to forgive her. She asked the court to remember that Mara had signed the contract beside Walter's grave while fully understanding what the promise meant. The judge imposed sentences totaling 28 years in state prison. Mara was ordered to pay restitution, permanently barred from funeral service and cemetery management work, and denied future authority over protected burial records. The judge said the punishment was not for being a wounded child or failing to save a struggling business. It was for repeatedly converting trust into property she believed she could spend. The sentence did not satisfy everyone. Prison did not give Clara back the years she carried a false reputation. It did not erase the weeks Amos's neighbors looked at him with doubt. It did not place Jenna beside her mother again. Mara was allowed to speak. She apologized to Ruth, Amos, Clara, Lenora, Jenna, and the affected families. She said she had once believed keeping Calder open was the same as preserving dignity. Her remorse mattered because it showed she understood the harm. It did not reverse it. Years later, Mara gave one prison interview. She admitted that she had spent her life trying to gain enough control that no one could make her feel helpless again. But Mara's explanation was not the final word. The final word belonged to the people forced to rebuild their mourning around her choices. Evelyn eventually returned to Pine Hollow after her parents' records were corrected, though never again every Sunday. Clara asked that her name be restored in Ruth's old employment records and requested nothing more. Jenna adopted Lillian's maiden name, not to erase her mother, but to refuse the version of survival Mara had tried to pass down. After the survey was completed, Lillian Bell's marker was placed according to the best evidence available. Mara was not permitted to attend. The certainty she had chased all her life remained incomplete. That was tragic. It was not injustice. Understanding where Mara Bell's darkness began does not mean forgiving what it became. Her mother's uncertain grave explained the wound. It did not choose the families who would live with its consequences. Mara made those choices herself.